Over the weekend, I did a poll on our YouTube community tab asking people how well they're getting along with the GeneateBlocks Navigation Block. And to my surprise, most people are either not super comfortable or struggling quite a bit. So in today's video, I thought we'd take a deeper dive into how the navigation block works. The GeneateBlocks Navigation Block is one of the more complex blocks available. There are a lot of different settings and a lot of elements stacked inside of that nav element. Now, I didn't have the foresight in the poll to ask exactly what people are struggling with, so I just started coming up with some different ideas of things I could cover. What I'm going to do in today's video is recreate a really complex navigation. Not because I think that people are struggling, need to be able to build out something this complex, but because we're going to be able to cover a lot of different things all inside of one video. You may not be able to start and finish this video building out this entire nav, but you're going to learn a ton of little tips and tricks along the way. Down in the comments below, I'd really love to know what didn't make sense and what did, so I can create some follow-up videos for this where we can really dive into some of these individual things that we're going to go over in today's video. So with that said, let's dive in and take a look at what we're building. We're really just focused on this nav bar at the top, so you can kind of ignore everything else. Now you'll see here on desktop, we have a setup with the logo all the way to the left, these buttons all the way to the right, and then all of our nav items are perfectly centered in the middle of our viewport. Now this is important to note because the space between the nav items and the buttons is actually smaller than the space between the nav items and the logo over here, which is what places these nav items right in the direct center of our screen, and this is going to be an important thing we need to solve. Of course, as we start making this smaller, we're going to run out of room for these to stay in the middle and not overlap with these buttons. So as that happens, that nav actually attaches to the button container over there and starts scooching into the side with it, which gives us a much more fluid look. Now we do have our nav here in the middle, but once we collapse down to our hamburger menu, I want to put that over on the right-hand side, which is just going to make it easier for people to click. So you'll see as we scrunch in here, we're going to lose room for all those nav items. And now our hamburger menu appears over on the right-hand side. So instead of being in the center, it's now been pushed over to this side. We'll keep scrunching things in here. And you can see we're going to lose room for these buttons. And as we lose room for those buttons, they one by one just disappear. Now, of course, we still need to be able to access those. So you can see when I open up my hamburger menu, as long as these are visible up here, they're not showing inside of my hamburger menu. But as I collapse down and the login button disappears, it shows up here inside my nav area. We'll close this down further so the contact sales shows up. And again, once the get started button shows up down here at the bottom. Of course, as we get smaller and smaller, these will just stack nicely on top of each other. And just like that, we have a fully responsive navigation bar that does a lot of different tricks that are pretty interesting to figure out inside of GenerateBlocks. So let's dive in and let me show you how I set this all up. So on the back end here under Appearance and Menus, I've just gone ahead and created our primary menu, which has all of our nav items inside of it. Now they don't go anywhere since this is just a demo site, but we have all those items in here, save for the buttons that are going to be on the right-hand side of the menu. We're actually not going to include these here inside the menu structure. We're going to do those separately since we need to show and hide them a little bit more dynamically. So once that's saved, we can go ahead and go to our elements. I've gone ahead and deleted that header you saw a second ago, and we're going to start from scratch by choosing a new element type, choosing block. We'll go ahead and hit create, and then we'll call this our header. Now to make this the header of our website, we need to go over here to element type and change that to site header. And then under location, we can go ahead and do entire site and go ahead and publish those changes. And now if we refresh on the front end, you can see our header has completely disappeared and we need to start over from scratch. So the first thing we're going to add in here is our site header. So if I just start searching, I'll find site header here, and you want to use that blue icon, which is the GenerateBlocks block for this. And we'll go ahead and put that on our screen. Now I'll pop open this list view so we can see what we're working with. Now the site header itself is pretty simple. All we'll need to do here is go into our spacing, and we're going to want to set some padding. I'll start out with something maybe like 16 pixels on the top and bottom, and then we'll go with 24 on the left and right, and we'll be able to manipulate this as we go. Now, if you remember back to our final header, we had the logo, the menu, and the buttons, so I'm going to put all of those inside their own container. So just inside this site header, I'm going to go ahead and add a container. Then I'm going to use my keyboard shortcut to go ahead and duplicate that 2 more times, so I have 3 containers in here. Let's go ahead and rename these so we don't get lost. We'll go ahead and call that logo. Our second one here we'll rename and call nav. And then our third one we'll go ahead and rename and call buttons. Now for our logo, I'll go ahead and just pop in a shape block. And I'll go into the shape in the library and custom SVG. And I'm going to go ahead and just paste in a logo I got from Logo Ipsum. We'll go ahead and change that width to auto, and we can leave the height at 30, which looks fine for this. Now we do need to make this a link so people can click it and go back to the home page. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this in a container, and we're going to change that tag name to an A. Of course, we're going to need to link this. I'll just put a / so it links back to home. And to make sure screen readers know what this does, I'm going to say navigate to home page. Now inside of our second container, I'll go ahead and pop open a new block, and I'm going to search for the navigation block. Here again, we want to make sure we're using that one with a blue icon so we know we're using the GenerateBlocks version, and we'll go ahead and just get that on the screen for now. Now in this last container for our buttons, we're going to want to pop in 3 different buttons. So I'll go ahead and just add our first one, and I'll just use my keyboard shortcut to duplicate that. We have log in, contact sales, and get started. Okay, so now we have most of the elements we need on our screen, and we need to start styling this up for our desktop layout. So the first thing I'm going to do is just go back to my site header here. You can see right now it's just display blocks, so it's stacking everything on top of each other. I'm going to go in here and change this layout to display grid. Now we're going to use grid here because I want to be really careful about putting that navigation right in the center of our screen, and that's going to be easier to do with grid than it is with Flexbox. So let's go into our grid layout here. Our first column, I want to be 1FR, so just whatever size it needs to take up. And then our second one, I want to do auto. And then our last one, 1FR. So this is going to help us place this navigation right in the center of the screen. That auto is just going to make it the width of the content inside of it. And then the 1FR on the left and right is just going to allow it to fill in space as it needs. Now I do want to go back to our alignment here and just align things to the center just so they get center aligned. We're probably going to need to do the same thing with our navigation over here. I'm going to change this to display flex and align the item center. We might actually need to do it on this one, so I'll just go ahead and do it while I'm at it. That way everything's just nice and aligned. Now our buttons are still cramped up against this left-hand side, so let's go to our buttons container here. We'll go ahead and change this to a flex, and then we'll make sure that the justify content is set to the end, which is going to push them over to the sides. Now we do need some gap in between these buttons, so let's just go in here under our flex layout, and we'll give this a column gap of maybe 8 pixels just so we have a little bit of space between them. Let's go ahead and save these changes and take a look at how things are looking at the front end. We can see because of our grid template columns declaration where we had 1FR, auto, 1FR, it's placed that nav right here in the center of our screen. No matter if there's less room here with the buttons and the logo, everything still looks good with those navigation items directly in the center of the screen. Of course, as we get down to the point where the buttons are going to collide with the nav, something's got to give. So now these buttons get quite a bit messed up. So that's definitely something we're going to have to tackle and stray away from the grid template columns we set up. But before we do that, let's do a little bit more styling to all these elements to make it look a little bit more like the demo we were looking at before. So the first thing I want to work on is the styling of these nav items here. So let's open up our navigation inside the menu container, inside the menu, and we get to our menu item. Now this is going to control each one of these items in here, and I wanted to make this font quite a bit smaller and then make it all caps. So we'll go inside the typography here, and I'm going to change this to 0.875 rem, which is going to make it quite a bit smaller. And then we're going to change that text transform to uppercase, which will just make all of these uppercase. Now I want to make sure to do the same thing on these buttons. And when we get to the buttons here, we actually have some styles that they're going to share and then some that are going to be all different. So we need to think about how we're going to add classes to these, especially since they need to reappear inside of our mobile menu. So let's go ahead and go into our login button. We'll just start working on that first. And I'm just going to call this nav button. And that's where we're going to put all the shared styles. So for that, I'm going to go ahead and move those local block styles over to this new class I created. And now we can start setting things up. I'm going to change this to maybe 0.5 em on the top and 0.5 em on the bottom. And then maybe we'll go with like 1.5 em on the left and right. We can always change this later if it doesn't work out great, but I think that'll give us a good starting place here. Now, as far as the colors, I want to control this individually on each one of the buttons since all of them are going to have different styling. So I'm going to go ahead and clear out that typography color. We'll clear out our background color, and we'll go in here under our border. All of these are going to have a 1 pixel border, so I'll go ahead and give that a 1 pixel border, but we'll make sure that that's cleared out so it doesn't have any values. Now let's go ahead and take a look at what things do on hover. Again, I just want to make sure I don't have any of these settings set here because I'm going to control these all with their own individual classes for each one of these buttons. So let's just go ahead and make sure all those are cleared out. Now all of these buttons do have a round pill shape. So I'm going to go back into my main here. We'll go under our border radius and I'm going to change this to 100 VW, which will just make sure it's nice and rounded. Now we do have too much padding on the top and bottom. That could be coming from this padding here, but we're also being influenced by the line height on this text. Since these are always just going to be a single line of text, I'm going to go ahead and change that line height to 1, and then we can go back in and start setting up our typography to match what we did over here in the nav. So I want to change this to 0.875 rem, which will make it quite a bit smaller, and then change that text transform to uppercase. Now, a lot of this padding is coming in from the fact that this is all set to flex and these buttons are quite a bit taller, so it's kind of growing to fit. But once we get rid of these default stylings that are on there, I think this is going to be a little bit better of a preview. So let's go ahead and go to these other buttons and we'll give them that same nav button class and we'll clear out all those block styles. So I'm just going to go through to all 3 of these, add the nav button, and clear out that block style. And now we can see that padding is a little bit tighter. In fact, I think it's too tight. So let's go back into that nav button class. We'll go into our spacing and maybe we change this to 1em on the top and bottom. And I think that looks quite a bit better. Now we can go ahead and start giving each one of these buttons their own individual styling. So here for our login button, I'm going to do all this styling on a class. We'll call this nav-button, and I'm going to do a double dash and say log-in. Go ahead and hit create, and we'll start with a blank style. For this one, we're going with a light gray background. I'll pick the 200 variant from my color palette here. We'll make sure that the typography is set to a dark color. We're going to go with neutral 700. And then under our border, I'm going to go in here and just make sure the border matches the background, which was our 200 value. Now on hover, we'll go ahead and just change this background color to 300, and we'll do the same thing for our border so you don't even really see our border, it's just blending in here. This is only going to be important because our last button, the border, is going to be visible on hover. So now when we hover over this button, you can see it's going from the lighter gray to the darker gray. Of course, it's happening quite abruptly, so we need to add a transition. All of these buttons are going to need a transition, so let's just go back into our nav button class. And that way we can add this to all of these buttons since they all share that nav button class. So go in here to the transition. I'll change it to maybe 0.25 seconds and go ahead and add that. And now when we hover over that, it's a lot smoother of a transition. Okay, that takes care of our login button for now. So let's go to our sales button. And here again, I'm just going to do nav-button. We'll do a double dash and we'll do contact and hit create. We'll start with a blank style. For our typography, we're going to go with white text on this, and it's going to have a blue background, which is kind of our brand primary color here. And then for the border, I just want that to match the background as well. Again, we'll go into hover. We'll make sure that typography is set to white. We'll make sure that these backgrounds are set to our hover color, which is just this darker blue, and same thing for our border here. And because we put that transition on the nav button class that they all share, this is already going ahead and inheriting that same little transition effect, so that button looks great as well. So let's go ahead and go to our get started button. Again, we're going to give this a class, nav button, double dash, get-started. We'll hit create, and we'll start with the blank style. Now this one is going to have white text. We'll go into the background and we're going to make this our 700, which is kind of a dark color here. And we're going to do the same thing for the border, giving it that 700 color from our palette. Now on hover, I actually want the background of this to be white. So we'll go in here and change the background color to white. Of course, that's going to make our text disappear. So we need to make that our 700. And our border can stay that 700 color. So we have kind of an outline button when we hover on top of this button. So let's go ahead and save our progress and take a look at how everything looks on the front end. We'll just go back here and refresh, and we can see all those styles we've created are now showing up here. Maybe I can zoom this in a bit just to give us a little bit better look. Now, of course, we're still running into that problem where everything's kind of colliding together. So that's probably the next problem we need to fix now that all of our button styles and our text styles look good here. So let's hop back into the editor. And I know one thing I want to do is make sure that I have some padding in between each one of these containers. So you can see our logo, our nav, and our buttons are all inside this site header. That site header we set to grid, but we don't have any gap between it. So let's go into our grid layout, and I'm gonna give this maybe just 8 pixels of column gap, just to make sure that they never technically collide, even though these links have some padding around them. Okay, we'll go ahead and save those changes. Let's refresh it on the front end here. And now we need to start figuring out where these are gonna collide and where we need to change this layout a little bit. So I'm gonna go ahead and scrunch this in, keeping an eye on this number here inside of my responsive settings. And you can see right there, my buttons get kind of funky. So I need to find exactly the breakpoint for this. So here it's at 1555, and at 1556, it looks perfect. So I want to make sure to change this layout once we get down to that 1555. In fact, I'll just go ahead and copy that to my clipboard so I don't forget when I'm not looking at it. We're going to hop back in here into the editor. So what we're going to want to do to solve this is we're going to actually want to change the site header from the grid we had originally to flex. This way we can make sure that these nav items stick over here with our buttons and don't cause the buttons to get kind of funky and on 2 lines. So to create this custom media query, I'm going to go in here and create a new media query. Inside there, we'll type in @media. We'll open up our parentheses and we'll do a max-width. And then I'm just going to paste in that value, that 1555, type in pixels and go ahead and hit create. So now at this breakpoint, I can change this from the display grid that we had before to a display flex. We'll go ahead and save those changes just so you can see how this might change things on the front end. When we're here at our 1555 breakpoint that we created, you can see everything's just kind of scrunching together. And when we go outside of that breakpoint, we can see it's back to how we had it before with our grid layout. So of course, we don't want all of these items to go all the way over to the left. So we need to go in here into our nav, and we need to set something at that same breakpoint again. So again, I'm going to go ahead and create another media query. We'll do @media, open our parentheses and do max width. Again, I'm just going to paste in that 1555 pixels value and hit create. And now we can go inside the spacing, and on the margin left, I'm going to change this to auto. That's just going to make sure to push as much spacing in between these nav items and this logo as possible. Let's go ahead and save those changes. Again, we'll refresh on the front end. And now you can see when we're above that breakpoint, we have our items right here in the middle. But as they get down and collide, now they're just sticking to these buttons over on the right-hand side, and everything's kind of going in together. This is a really cool little trick that I just figured out building out this menu, but I can definitely see myself using this more and more. So now that we got that taken care of, we need to see when we need to employ our hamburger menu, because obviously we're going to run out of room pretty quickly again. So you can see right here around this breakpoint, it's breaking our nav into 2 lines, and we obviously don't want that to happen. We can see that's happening here right around the 1304 mark. Let's just say 1305 to make it a little bit easier. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that value to my clipboard. We'll go back into the editor here, and I'm going to open up our navigation. And if we go into the settings here, I can change that mobile breakpoint to the value I just copied to my clipboard, which was 1305. Now, if we go ahead and save that and refresh on the front end, you can see here at 1305, we have our hamburger menu, and at 1306, we have our full menu. So that works perfectly, but we do want to get this hamburger menu over to the right-hand side, and we need to style that up a little bit. So let's go ahead and get that moved over to the right at that same breakpoint. So if you remember, our breakpoint for the mobile menu was 1305. So I just want to go ahead and grab this entire navigation wrapper that we have inside of our site header. We'll go into our styles, and we're going to create another media query for this. So we'll type in @media, open and close our parentheses. We'll do a max-width, paste in that 1305 pixels, and go ahead and hit create. Now for this, to get it over on the right-hand side, I just want to go into our flex layout, and I want to change the order to 3. This is just going to make it the 3rd item inside that flex container, so that will push it all the way over to the right-hand side. Go ahead and save those changes, refresh on the front end, and now you can see our mobile menus over here on the right. Of course, we still have that auto margin on it, so it's pushing everything over from the left of it over to the side, so we need to make sure to get rid of that. To do that, I'll just go back into our spacing. You can see that auto is being inherited. I'm just going to type in unset, which will just get rid of it. But now we need to give that auto margin to our buttons here, which need to be still pushed away from the logo. So I'll go into our buttons container here. You can see we're still working with the same media query. So all I need to do is go into our spacing and change that margin left to auto. Go ahead and hit save. And now if we refresh it on the front end, we can see our hamburger menu is over here on the right, and we have all that auto space in between our buttons and logo. So now let's just go ahead and bring this up. We can see at 1313, it looks like our desktop menu, but as we get down below that breakpoint, we switch over to where this goes into a hamburger menu and it moves over to the right-hand side. Now, before we move on from this, let's go ahead and style this up a little bit better. This is one of those things that you kind of have to do blind inside the editor because we can't preview what that button looks like when we're at these desktop sizes because we've created kind of a custom size for when it breaks to a hamburger menu. So let's just go ahead and go back to our menu, and here in the menu toggle, if we go into our settings, we can see the style shortcuts for the background and text. I just want to make sure that the background is always transparent. So I'm just going to open up each one of these and slide this over to make sure it's transparent. And then for the text, we'll go ahead and match with our 700 color for the text normal, and then we'll change it maybe to 950 on hover, just so we have some kind of a hover effect since people are probably going to see this hamburger menu on desktop since our breakpoint for it is so wide. Now, because we created these two different colors for hover, I think we should replicate that same thing on these menu items here. So I'm just going to go back to our menu item. We'll make sure that this text is set to 700, and then on hover, we're going to go ahead and change this to 950. So now we have this nice color on hover for those as well. Let's go ahead and save our changes again, refresh on the front end, and now you can see our hamburger menu looks quite a bit better. I guess since we're already working on how this header collapses, let's just go ahead and keep going down further. Obviously, we're going to run into a point here where not all of this can fit, and we can see right here it starts to collide and our buttons get a little bit funky. So this is happening right around 674. Again, I'm going to change this to 675 just to make it a number that's a little bit easier to work with. And again, I'm going to go ahead and copy this to my clipboard. So under 675, I want this login button to disappear. Now, eventually we're going to be putting it inside this mobile navigation, but I haven't set any of that up yet. So let's just worry about this main header for now. So here at 675, we just need to get rid of this login button. So go back in here into the editor. I'm going to go ahead and open up our buttons here, and we see our login button. There's a few things we need to clean up in here first. Like I didn't give any of these links. I'm going to go ahead and give them a link now. And all of these are kind of like a list of actions. And right now, this is just a div with some links inside of it. I think we need to make this a little bit more semantic. So let's click on our buttons container, and I'm going to change that tag name from a div to an unordered list or UL. Now inside of it, I'm going to want list items with links inside of each one of those list items. So I need to go ahead and wrap each one of these buttons inside their own container. So I'll go ahead and grab the first one, the second one, and the third one. Now for all of these, I want to go ahead and highlight all of them and change them to a list item. And we need to get rid of some of this default styling. So we'll go back to our buttons here, and I'm going to go under lists, and I'm going to change that list style type to none to get rid of our bullet points there. Now, if I go ahead and save this, we can preview this a little bit better on the front end. We can see that these have kind of gotten out of alignment. And if I go ahead and click on that UL container, the thing that we turned into an unordered list, you can see it has some margin around it. Now this just comes default when you add to any list. If we go into the computed value, you can see it has a margin of 54 on the left and 27 on the bottom. We want to make sure to get rid of that. So again, with that button wrapper selected, I'm going to change that margin left and the margin bottom to 0. We'll go ahead and save those changes. And now when we refresh, that looks quite a bit better. So now that we have this list working a little bit more semantically, let's go ahead and get rid of that login button. Let's remember exactly where we wanted that to break. That was at 675. So go ahead and copy that value to my clipboard again. We're going to go back into the editor, and I'm going to grab this first wrapper, which is the wrapper around my login button. Again, we're going to need to create a media query for this. So I'm going to type in @media, open my parentheses, max width, paste in that value and type in pixels. We'll go ahead and hit create. And now we can just change this display from default to none, which is just going to hide it away. Go ahead and save those changes, refresh on the front end, and you'll see our login button is gone. But as soon as we go 1 pixel bigger, it comes back and then just disappears. So now as this shrinks down, we can see our login button disappears right in time. Now we need to go ahead and do the same thing for these other buttons. So let's go ahead and scrunch this in and see where this needs to break. Again, right now it's breaking right here around 573. Again, let's just go with 575, and a little bit of an easier number to work with. We'll go back in here, grab our second list item, and again, we're going to create a new media query. Type in @media max width, paste in that 675 pixels and hit create. And again, just layout, display, none. Save those changes, test everything on the front end again, and now we can see that contact sales button goes away just in time like the login button did before. We need to repeat that one more time here with this get started button. We can see that's actually happening right here around 406. Let's just say 410. Again, these numbers are just a little bit easier for my brain to remember. So we'll go into this last list item here, go ahead and create a new media query, type in max-width, paste in that 410 pixels, hit create, and change that layout from display block to display none. Again, save changes, refresh on the front end, and we can see now all of this is just disappearing before anything ever collides or starts to look funky. I do think our padding on this is a little bit too big as we get down here to mobile sizes, and that might actually affect where these needed to disappear. Let's go back and change the site headers padding here on the mobile breakpoint. We'll go in here into the padding, and we're going to change this to maybe 16 pixels. Now, like I said, since we kind of magic numbered all of these breakpoints here, this might change the way things work a little bit, but I think everything should still disappear on time. It's just disappearing a little bit sooner than it did before, but all of this is never colliding and still looks pretty good. At this point, we need to turn our attention to what happens inside this hamburger menu. If I click it, you can see things aren't looking so good right now. So let's go ahead and go into our menu container here. We'll go back to our settings cog, and we can see that the mobile background is set to black with the text set to white. I want to go ahead and change this to my neutral 50 for the background, and we'll set that mobile text to our 700, which just matches everything we did before. In fact, we could go in here and set the mobile text to the 700 and then the 950 on hover, just to make sure that it's consistent with everything we had on desktop. If we go ahead and save those changes and refresh now, we can see we open up our menu and we have all of our items inside of it. However, I don't really like this full overlay in this case. I'd like to still see my top nav here. So we'll go back into our navigation, and here under mobile menu type, I'm going to change this from full overlay to partial overlay, save those changes. And now when we refresh it and open up that hamburger menu, you can see this just opens up below our navigation, which allows us to still see all of these buttons. So in this case, this is going to look good as soon as we open up that hamburger menu. Where we're going to run into problems is here. When our login button disappears, we need it to show up inside of this hamburger menu so people still have access to log in even when the buttons disappeared. Same thing goes for that contact sales and get started. All right, so to add all of these buttons inside this menu container, I want to go inside the menu container here and just add a new container inside of it. Now we're previewing all this on desktop. We're going to end up hiding this away when it doesn't need to show, but it's a little bit easier to work with this here on desktop where we can see everything at once and it's not actually inside of that hamburger menu where we have to show and hide it constantly. So just like we did with our nav buttons over here, I need to create a container. Again, this is going to be a list, so I might as well go ahead and change this to an unordered list, and we can get rid of that margin that comes along with it like we did before. We'll get that bottom margin to 0 and the left margin to 0, and we can go down to our list and change that list style type to none. Now inside of it, we're going to need 3 containers just like we did before, so I'll do 1, 2, 3, and inside of those, we're going to need our buttons again. So we'll go ahead and add a button. We could just copy and paste these, but we're going to have to do things a little bit differently. And I think that the practice of setting all these up could be helpful. So I'm just going to go ahead and add these in one at a time. We'll go ahead and add the contact sales and then the get started. Now for our list, we want all of these to be next to each other. So I'm going to change this display to flex. And then we'll go ahead and make sure we have just a little bit of gap in between each one of these. Now here we can go ahead and give these same styles. So that was our nav button. All 3 of these can share that nav button style. So I'll give it to each of these items. And we can get rid of any block stylings that came along with the default buttons that come inside GenerateBlocks. Now, each of these have their own unique styles, so let's go ahead and give them those classes as well. So we're going to call this the login one. We'll go to our contact sales, and I believe that one just had the word contact in it. And then our get started one here had the word get started in it. So now we have all three of these buttons. We can see there is a little bit of padding from this, and I think this might be coming from our list. So let's just go ahead and save those changes, refresh it on the front end, and let's take a look at what's happening here. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight that. We can see we're not actually seeing any kind of padding or gap inside of this. So I think it just might be some kind of artifact inside of the editor, or it could have to do with the fact that I didn't actually change these to list items. They're still divs. So let's go back in here and change each one of these to a list item. I'm just going to highlight all three, go to my settings cog and change this to a list item. That should take care of that. And now we should be back in business. Go ahead and save those changes, refresh again, and we'll make sure that all of this is lining up. Like I said, we're seeing some kind of padding in the editor that we're not seeing in the front end here, so I'm just going to ignore that for now. But now you can see we have our semantics correct with the UL and the LIs inside of it. So that's perfect. Of course, we don't want this to show here when we're on desktop. We just want to start showing these as the other items disappear. So let's go ahead and work on that first. If we remember back to all those breakpoints we created, that login button went away right at 675. So we need to make sure that it shows up inside of our mobile menu once we get to that same breakpoint. Now before we used a max width, in this case, we're going to be using some min widths. So let's go back here to the wrapper around my login button, and we're going to go in here and create a new media query. This time we'll type in @media, but instead of max width, we're going to be typing in min width. And this happened at the breakpoint 675. We actually want to go with 676 for this since we're using min width instead of max width. So I'm going to do 676 pixels and then close my parentheses and hit create. So at this point, what we're saying is at a minimum of 676, we want to change this to display none. Let's just go ahead and save the changes and make sure our logic worked on that. I'm going to go ahead and widen this out again where we can see all of them. And you can see our login button is gone right now. But as we get down here to that 676, if I go ahead and open up this menu, you can see our login button has reappeared. Even if we open it up here, you can see it's showing and hiding, which is exactly what we want. We just need to do the same thing to our other buttons here. So our contact sales button went away at 575. So we're going to make this one show and hide at 576. Again, I'm just going to go back to our desktop version here, which gives us a better preview. I'll go ahead and grab the wrapper around our contact sales button. And again, we're going to create a media query. So I'm going to type in media, again, min width, and this is 576 pixels. We'll go ahead and hit create. We'll go to our layout and change that to display none. Save our changes, refresh it on the front end. And if we open this up, we can see that contact sales isn't showing, but as soon as it disappears out of the top menu, all of these things are popping in inside of the mobile menu here, which is perfect. We need to do the same thing here for our get started button. So let's remind ourselves where that breakpoint was. We did that at 410. So I want to do this min width at 411. Again, I'm going to grab that wrapper around our get started. We'll make sure we can preview this. And we'll go into our media queries, type in @media, min width, and this is 411 pixels. Go ahead and close those parentheses. And we're going to change this to a display none, hit save. We'll preview this again on the front end. And we can see we don't see any of those showing now when we have our desktop menu or our hamburger menu here. Again, inside the hamburger menu, none of them are showing. But as they disappear from the top, you're going to see they start showing up here at the bottom, which is exactly what we wanted. Now, it's been a while since you saw the original demo of this, but we actually wanted all of these buttons down here at the bottom. We need some padding inside that container, and we want these to wrap nicely, so we have just a little bit of cleanup work to do. Again, we might be flying blind on some of these things since they're kind of hard to see here inside the editor, and we're getting this phantom padding here. But let's just tackle these one at a time. I'm going to go ahead and go back to our desktop width. This is really just because I want these settings to inherit all the way down. Even though we can't see it right now, we're still affecting these things, and the mobile and different breakpoints are going to inherit it. And it's going to be easier to just set it here rather than set it on each of the individual breakpoints. So let's go ahead and just give this some padding first. We'll go ahead and give it 20 pixels on the left and right. We'll save those changes. I'm just going to keep saving and refreshing just so you can see what changes we're making and how they affect everything. So now instead of these buttons being crammed against the side, they have just a little bit of padding on the left and right, which is perfect. Now I do want to push these buttons all the way down to the bottom of the screen. So let's go back in here. We'll go inside of our menu container here. At this point, I only want this to happen when we go to our hamburger menu. So we need to remember exactly where that hamburger menu broke so we can do these settings at that exact same breakpoint. I'll go back to our navigation and our settings cog, and that was at 1305. So we'll go back here to our menu container and we'll create a new media query that's at media max width 1305 pixels. Go ahead and hit create. And at this point, what we want to do is change this display to flex. We want to change the direction to column. And then we can go inside this list that we have of all of our buttons, and we can go in here to the spacing and change the margin top to auto. Now again, we're having to do some of this blind, so let me go ahead and just save those changes and refresh it here. And you can see now when we open this up, because we changed this to be a flex container with a column, it's going ahead and stacking these things on top of each other. And then the wrapper that goes around these buttons, we changed that top margin to auto, which is just pushing everything to the bottom of the container here. So now we can see as all these things disappear from the top, they're going directly into the bottom. Now we don't want these buttons to break like this, and we actually want them to fill up space a little bit better. So let's work on those things next. We'll go inside of our flex settings here under flex layout, and we're going to change this to wrap. Again, just to show you, I'm going to go ahead and save, refresh, open this up. And you can see now as we get down to smaller sizes, it's going ahead and putting those buttons on a separate line instead of scrunching them all together, which is definitely a better look. Obviously, we need some gap in between those. So again, we'll just add that same 8 pixel row gap to match what we had for the column gap. And now if we open it up, we can see a nice little gap between these. Now here we can see all the buttons are left aligned, which is fine. In the inspiration side, I found they actually had these fill up more space, and we can do that by just going to each one of these list items here, going into the layout, the flex layout, and changing that flex grow to 1. And then each one of our buttons inside here, we can go ahead and change those to flex as well, which is going to allow them to fill up all the space. So we'll go ahead and change that to flex. We'll go into our alignment and make sure it's centered. And we'll do the same thing for each one of these buttons. Flex, center, and flex, center. Go ahead and save those changes again, refresh on the front end. And now when I open it up, you can see these are going ahead and filling up that space nicely. So there's not a bunch of blank space at the bottom of this container. And as we get down to where they will only fit on one line by themselves, they're a nice full width button. So now let's start back at our desktop version and we'll cycle through everything to make sure we got everything working just like we wanted. Here on desktop, our nav items are perfectly centered in the screen. And as we scrunch down and they collide with the buttons over here, they kind of attach themselves and scroll in to the left perfectly. Now, once those are about to collide, we get our hamburger menu, which gets pushed over to the right-hand side. If we open it up, we can see all these buttons at the top. So of course they're not showing at the bottom. And as we scrunch this down further, our login button disappears, but it does appear inside of our menu here. Our contact sales does the same thing, and now we have contact sales inside the menu. And as we get down small enough to where the get started button goes away, we can see it down here. And if we scrunch this in all the way, all these buttons just stack nicely on top of one another. So I think everything inside this menu is working exactly like we wanted. And this is a fairly complex menu, but it can all be created right here inside GeneateBlocks. As you'll see, I never opened up the customizer to write any CSS. We were able to do all of this just inside of the UI. Now, most navbars you build out probably don't need to be this complex, but it's pretty interesting seeing all the things you can do inside of this GeneateBlocks element. Like I said at the beginning of this video, I would love to know which parts of the navigation block you're struggling with, so let me know down in the comments. That way I can follow up with some more dedicated videos on each one of these different aspects. Hopefully you enjoyed today's video. If you did, I would really appreciate a thumbs up. And if you want to make sure to catch the next one, hit subscribe and we'll see you then.